Welcome to the Money and Meaning Show with Jeff Bernier, a show dedicated to helping you gain the confidence and freedom to lead a life of personal significance and help you get your actions and resources in alignment with what matters most.
Hello and welcome to the Money and Meaning Show. My name is Jeff Bernier. I am your host and guide as we have conversations periodically with friends and resources that I come across that I think could add great value to you in terms of trying to figure out what gives you purpose in life and how do you create the margin to go pursue it. So that's what we're about. We're trying to have meaningful conversations with people that can help us figure out what matters and help us get our actions and resources in alignment with what matters. And I got to tell you, I've been looking forward to this show for a little over a month when I found this guest, and he is really a really interesting guy. So let me do a quick intro so we can get right into it. So my guest today is Paul Ollinger. Paul is a really interesting guy. I met him through Brian Portnoy at Shaping Wealth, which is a consultant to our firm. And he was a guest on one of Brian's shows not long ago. But Paul was an early employee at Facebook, one of the first 250 employees. And he retired at 42 from the corporate world, only to find himself, according to his bio, is bored, lonely, and driving his wife crazy. And so he said, what can I do now? So he started a great podcast called Crazy Money, which deals with some of the same types of things we deal with in a different way. And since he had nothing better to do, I guess he picked up stand-up comedy. So I can't wait to hear about all of that. But he's a well-known stand-up comedian, does a lot of headliners around the country with a lot of places you've been and know about, with a lot of talent that you know about. But he spends a lot of his time doing the podcast, doing stand-up comedy, doing corporate events, but he's just a really cool guy. So let's get into it with my new friend, Paul Ollinger. Paul, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Yeah, really, really cool. I always start the show just because I want the audience to connect with who you are personally, if you don't mind. So do you mind just kind of giving me a quick rundown of your family and kind of what you're about?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Dunwoody, Georgia, not far from where you are. One of 6 kids in a big Catholic family. We had everything we needed, and parents who stayed together for 55 years, and a very fun, if somewhat chaotic household growing up. And I was the 5th of 6 kids. I probably needed more attention than I felt like I got, and that eventually manifests in me becoming a stand-up comedian and doing this podcast. But the connection to money and meaning was that I remember there being some stress, financial stress in my home. And again, we had everything we needed, but it was always like my parents were Depression era people, and they washed and reused tinfoil and sandwich bags and stuff like that. And I just remember thinking as a kid, someday I'm going to make a lot of money, so I won't stress about money. And just saying that out loud is pretty hilarious. But that drove me to want to go to, have a big corporate career, which I eventually did. And we can talk about that. And today I've got 2 kids of my own. They're 13 and 14 years old. And my wife of 16 years, and we live in Brookhaven. Cool.
The big Catholic family and frugal, thrifty, because of their mindset. Yeah. My dad, you sound like my dad in some respects in terms of, reusing nails and stuff. Crazy. That's kind of what it was about. So, let's talk about your journey, because you talked about your corporate life. Let's talk about that, because you obviously were well educated. Kind of give us your educational background and your early career. Tell us about what you were doing and what your goals were when you were a young guy out of college.
Yeah, it's funny because I remember I did plays in high school. I acted some in high school, and I remember being on stage and thinking, this is the most fun I've ever had. But it's not a real thing. This isn't something that people actually do to make a living. Obviously it is, but for some people. But the risk involved with pursuing a creative life was something that I was not oriented towards. So when I went to Rhodes College, I studied business and eventually got my MBA, went to Dartmouth, and really was kind of pushing towards the corporate life. Coincidentally, I was asked to host a talent show at Tuck, the business school at Dartmouth, and I told jokes in front of an audience for the first time in my life. and I absolutely murdered. And I had this
Murdered as
feeling,
in good or bad?
murdered as in good. Murdering
Okay.
is good in comedy.
Okay.
Dying is
You
not
gotta
good.
help me out here with the entertainment lingo. So so you killed it.
I killed. I did not die on stage. All these very morose terms for comedy, but I had a great set, and I felt this narcotic wave of laughter hit me, and I was like, "Oh, this is what I'm supposed to do." Among this group of very smart people, this is what makes me different. Is that I'm funny, and so I thought, having borrowed $80,000 to get that MBA in 1995, which would be 160 or something like that today. I thought, I want to be a stand-up comedian, which is not what you want to learn when you go to business school and you borrow that money. And so, but I did some math pretty quickly and realized that I wasn't going to be able to do that and pay my loans back, which is a very, silly notion that people would actually work hard to pay their loans back.
Yeah. Shocking, isn't it?
Yeah. But I did. And so I said, well, what's the closest thing I could do to stand-up comedy? I thought, well, I want to be in the TV world or the movie business. And so I thought someday I'll be discovered in a marketing meeting or something. But I couldn't get anybody to talk to me in those industries because I didn't have any experience. So I thought, well, this internet thing is new and nobody has any experience in the internet, so I might as well go into the internet business. I talked my way into a job at a place called launch.com, which eventually became a music website. We went public and then we crashed like everybody else in 2000. And I didn't pay off any of my loans. But then Yahoo bought us at the bottom of the dot-com bubble for change that Jerry Yang found in his couch. And it was a great place to be. Yahoo had been beaten up like everybody else. So when I started there in 2001, I guess, we got options right at the bottom of the market. And then as the business came back under Terry Simmel and Dan Rosenswag from 01 to 05, those options appreciated. I paid off my loans. I put some money in the bank. And then I moved to LA to do stand-up comedy for 2 years.
Oh, wow. Wow. Okay. And so that was your corporate. So did you leave the corporate world at that point?
I left thinking that when I got to Los Angeles, they'd be like, "Where have you been? We've been waiting for you. We're dying to make you famous." And that's not how it works. And when you get out there, you realize, oh, this isn't something that you just show up and people, and now it happens to some people, but it didn't happen to me. And it doesn't happen to 99.999% of people who think it's going to, that you get out there and you go, oh, this is a 10-year journey before you even figure out who you are. Ralphie May, the late Ralphie May, told me one night, I was hosting at the Improvs in Orange County in Brea and Irvine. And one night, as I was clearly not qualified for this job yet, but one night Ralphie May said to me, the late Ralphie May, he said, "Don't worry, you'll start to figure it out in about 8 years." And I was like, 8 years?
Yeah, that's a lifetime.
I was making like $400,000 a year at Yahoo, like I don't have 8 years. My opportunity cost was way too high. And the thing is if you think about it in those terms, you're never going to make it because it can't be plan B. Comedy can't be plan B. It's got to be plan A. So I did it for 2 years and then I got engaged to my wife and I found myself thinking, I don't want to be a deadbeat husband being supported by his wife. I want to have kids. And so when I started thinking about maybe I should get another job, and the phone rang one day and it was a buddy of mine from Yahoo who said, "I'm looking for a salesperson in Los Angeles for this small social media company that I'm working for." And that's how I became the 250th employee at Facebook.
Gotcha. And how long were you at Facebook?
About 4.5 years.
Okay. So you were there with the rapid growth, and obviously
it was insane.
I have to assume that was fairly lucrative as well.
Well, it was extremely lucrative. I didn't know how lucrative. I probably wouldn't have left if I knew how lucrative it was going to be. But I was there when I started. Facebook had about 25 million monthly unique users. And I think when I left, they had about 1 billion. And today it's north of 3 billion. And so, the company went from like 250 employees to maybe 4,000 or 5,000. And today it's got north of 30,000. The growth was geometric during my whole time there.
Yeah. But this whole time, in the back of your, I guess I was going to say your mind, but I'm going to say in your heart, there was something else that was kind of calling you to the stage to entertain people, it sounds like.
Yeah. I mean, I when I started Facebook, I tried to keep doing comedy for a little while, but I'm sort of an all-in person. And so.
Yeah. Well, back to your comment, you got to be all in whatever you're doing.
I think so. And for me, it was like, well, if I'm going to work at this company, I'm going to be all in at this company. And it's not going to be a halftime thing. And I'm going to do it my very best. And I got promoted twice and, in the space of just a few years. And I was running the West Coast sales team. And then they asked me to move to Palo Alto. And I was like, at that point in my career, I had since business school, I had lived in New York, LA, San Francisco, New York, then LA again. And so when they asked me to move to Palo Alto, having just had a kid, I was like, if I'm moving anywhere, I'm going home to Atlanta where I grew up. And I really was longing to put some roots down, to be a part of a place and to stop this kind of frenetic life I'd been living. Like I want to be a part of a place. And I'd always missed Atlanta. I love this town. And my parents were older and sick, and both of whom have since passed away. And I got to be a part of, the very end years of their life. I got to help contribute to their care. And that was a very meaningful experience. And so we moved back to Atlanta, and shortly thereafter, I left the company.
Interesting, because when I read your bio, my thought was, how do you come home and tell your wife that you're leaving corporate America to be a stand-up comedian? I mean, that would be, first of all, being a stand-up comedian, I can't think of anything that requires more courage, quite frankly.
Yeah.
You're naked up there. That's a Southern term for you Northerners. It's naked, I guess, but you are totally exposed. And I want to impress people. I don't want people to say bad things about me. And, you say boo and I'll run, but you've got to have courage to do that.
Or obsession, or a deep need for attention, or the things that drive stand-up comedians are not. It's the lack of the fear to be up there. It's almost like you're pursuing it. It's a version of skydiving or whatever other thing that you do to get your adrenaline going. Yeah. So, and as far as my wife goes, I told her on our very first date that I was going to quit Yahoo and go do stand-up comedy. So she was warned.
Okay.
And then and when
right. Did you get that in writing?
I did not get it in writing.
Okay.
I should have had it notarized.
Yeah.
But then, I got to a point where, I knew what my stock was worth, and it was worth more than any amount of money I'd ever imagined having.
You won the game that you thought you were setting out to play in the corporate world.
That number is incredibly relative, because once you get to that level, you start hanging out with other people who have that kind of money, and then you're dealing with people who have twice or 10 times that amount of money. And so, there really is this insatiable desire to have more. And that's one of the things that we've talked about a lot on the podcast. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to come back to that. But in terms of your conversation with your wife, obviously you just mentioned that you talked about it as you were dating, that this was your passion and you were going there at some point. But not only that, my impression was you were leaving the corporate world to do something risky, but you were leaving the corporate world to be with your family in a way.
When I left Facebook, I didn't have a plan. I'd worked 4.5 years. It was a very stressful place to work. There were a lot of politics. And so really, I just didn't want to be a part of that game anymore. The game wasn't working for me. And I just was like, you know what? I just don't want to work for a while. And I didn't have a plan. I wasn't retiring. I was going to stop doing that. And so I did. And, the joke in Silicon Valley is the problem with doing nothing is knowing when to stop. And so.
What a great line.
Yeah, it's a great line, because when, you'd be surprised, or those of whoever's listening would be surprised that when you stop working, you'd be surprised how easy it is to fill your day with lots of positive stuff. You can work out, you can drive your kids to school, you can, visit with your aging parents, you can do all this stuff. And you have a great, but then before you know it, a year's gone by, and you go, well, what am I working on long term? Like, besides being a good brother, husband, parent, et cetera, how am I growing personally? And you very quickly realize, or I'll speak in the first person, I very quickly realized that I was getting an enormous amount from work that I wasn't giving myself credit, or wasn't giving work credit for supplying. That, if you think about work as just a paycheck, when you stop, you go, okay, well, what about those friends I had at work? What about the feeling of satisfaction I had in solving people's problems, even though it might not feel like that on a daily basis? What about when people call and ask me my opinion about a problem they're working on? Well, they don't do that anymore when you stop working. And, you realize, you think about Maslow's hierarchy. You think about work as just providing for those first two layers of safety and security and physiological needs. But when it comes to belongingness and self-worth, self-esteem, you go, oh, work's really been providing that. But I hadn't been thinking about that. Work gives you a place in the world where, you're Paul Ollinger, head of West Coast sales at Facebook. And then people ask you, well, what do you do when you're not working? You go, I don't know. Who am I?
And that's a hard thing. I had a guest on recently that said, yeah, how do you go from being the executive vice president of sales to just third guy in the Starbucks line?
I mean, that's kind of the question. And no, you're not you're not your paycheck, you're not your job title, but it's part of who you are. And it's part of how you show up and add value to the world. Because, there's a lot of bad workplaces. I don't mean to be so cavalier or entitled that I don't think that there's a lot of negative places to work. I've had the great fortune to work with outstanding people my entire life. And so when you leave a positive environment like that, just because it's stressful, and then you go, well, you're being paid a lot of money because you're solving other people's problems. You're helping your customers build their businesses. You can't screw people over on an ongoing basis, right? I mean, you have to create value for other people, or you will not make any money. And so when you stop creating value for other people, when you stop being a part of this ecosystem of, the digital media world, which is one of the most fascinating industries I could think to be a part of in the last 30 years, when you walk out of that, you got to find other ways to replace it in terms of your personal growth, in terms of your relationships, and in terms of what are you focused on that's, more than 30 days, 180 days out.
Thank you for saying all those things, because that was one of my big questions was, if you're relatively financial secure at 42, speaking to my audience, which is really mid to late career executives who are trying to figure out what's next. I mean, that's who I try to speak to, and that's who we serve professionally in our wealth management company is, mid to late career executives who are trying to go to the locker room at halftime and say, okay, what are we going to do in the second half?
It's a big question.
And it's a dangerous season for the reasons you just mentioned in that transition if you don't have something to retire to.
You're performing a service here because this is not a topic that is polite conversation. You can lean over to your buddy at the country club, after a round of golf and say, hey, you sold your company 2 years ago. What's it been like? What did you, everybody thinks, hey, you just made a pile of money.
And you just sold your third child, essentially.
Yeah, good. But people think, hey, look, what could possibly be wrong with that? But the studies show that there is a meaningful change to your psyche, that there's a crisis of sadness and dislocation and self-doubt when these successful people lose the focus they have. They walk away from the baby they built. Maybe they made a pile of money. They had a 30-year career. They were EVP, whatever, and then they got, downsized. And yeah, they got more than enough money, but they got to answer the question, okay, who am I in this world if I'm not Big Joe Stud in the business world? And it happens to everybody eventually if you live long enough, that you're going to go from business person to non-business person. And where do you find that esteem, that status? How do you compare yourself against the people who are young and coming up now that you're in the back half of your life and you're undeniably on the downhill? What are you going to work on to express who you are? You still got a lot of energy left. You still got a lot to offer. You still have a lot of thoughts. How do you create value, and for whom do you create it?
Yeah. So you're on this journey, on this strategizing what I'm doing going forward after, act one, what am I going to do in act two and act three and act four? So any advice you would give to someone who's, maybe 5 years from retirement, who's trying to think about these things? I mean, you've become sort of a student of these ideas, at least looking at your guest and the conversations you have on Crazy Money, which, again, we'll promote that later in the show more, but that's a great podcast for you guys that are struggling with these kinds of things. And we'll talk about the show in a minute. But any advice for that mid to late career executive who's maybe a few years out and they're just kind of saying, okay, you don't want to plan it the day you walk out the door. You need to do some pre-planning perhaps.
You definitely need to do some pre-planning. And I think that's, you will benefit from really trying to imagine your life absent of work. Some of the questions I ask is, what are you willing to spend 10 years getting good at? Because if you want to reinvent yourself in retirement, you still have to go through the 10,000 hour rule, and if you think, well, I'm going to
again, Paul,
what's that?
Ask that 10-year question again.
Yeah. What are you willing to spend 10 years getting good at? I've been doing comedy. I didn't go right into comedy again after I left because we were back in Atlanta. I didn't know where to start. I was afraid of failure. And I knew that the runway, it's a very long runway, but the 10,000 hour rule is a pretty good metric. And if you do something full time for 5 years, that's 10,000 hours. But really, what are you willing to spend a decade getting good at until you start making any money again? Because that's kind of what it's going to be. And if you want to reinvent yourself, you need to recognize that here's the problem. You spend 30 years learning how to be great at whatever you're doing now. And if you shift gears, you're going to go back to being an amateur. And it's a very disconcerting mindset when you go from being the expert to being the newbie. And on some level, it's refreshing. On other levels, it's like, I'm not the guy anymore. I've got to accept this with humility that people aren't going to come to me, asking me for, questions about this new craft that I'm working on. And so you have to be ready for that. I recommend you sit down and you write down exactly what are you going to be working on for the next 5 years? What are your days going to look like? Actually make a schedule and say this is the ideal week. This is how many weeks of vacation I'm going to take this year. This is my biggest, the thing I have to stay disciplined about is not going on golf trips, not going on ski trips. I mean, I go on a couple every year, but if I went on as many as I got invited on, I'd do nothing but that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and your knees would be shot.
Well, my knees are going to be shot anyway. But I mean, if you really want to work on something, and there's a lot of, hey, you got to invest in your friendships and life is short and all that kind of stuff. But at a certain point, if you want a back half career, if you want to start over and be good at something, you should say no to all this, not all this stuff, but to a lot of the stuff that comes your way. And you got to say, okay, well, how many trips am I going to take with my family every year? How many I'm going to go parents' weekend at kids' college because that's really, really important to me. Whether we're going to go on vacation, we're going to do 10 days in Europe or whatever. Like, okay, but so plot that out and then say, well, when are you going to work? And what are you going to work on? And who are you going to work on it with? And how will you know if you're going to be successful? What does success look like? How will this make me feel? Because, you'll continue whatever you dedicate yourself to getting good at. And if you spend 20 or 30 hours a week working on it, allowing for the other things in life that, you've wanted to do while you were working, especially physical fitness and spending time with your family and those things, maybe going to see parts of the world, but how will you will improve, but how will you know that you're improving? Because the problem is with non-professional activity is that we're so used to measuring our progress with money. And you don't have that in your new world. Nobody's going to pay you anything until you get really good at it, but it's going to take 5 years to get good at it. And it's going to take 10 years to monetize it, if at all.
So how do you define work? What would be your definition of work?
Well, I think that it's endeavoring toward a goal, and the beauty and the difficulty of going to a world where you don't have somebody else telling you, whether even if you work for yourself, it's your customers, it's your bankers, it's your board, whatever. You don't have anybody else defining the guardrails and the milestones, the mileposts or whatever. You have to define them for yourself. And you have to find sort of an internal clock, or even, you can write them all down.
But it's not all monetary or financial.
I mean, mine hasn't been monetary at all. It's how much money are you willing to lose depending upon which craft you're getting after, try to get after something that's not capital intensive is something that I would say if you want to preserve capital and do just producing a podcast I could spend $250,000 a year on this thing and still not be able to monetize it. With publicists and production and guest bookers and blah, 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 and travel and all this kind of stuff, there's no limit to what you can sink into a hobby. There's none.
Well, at the end of the day, you do things because you're called to do them at some level, I guess.
Yeah, but then okay, so to what extent though? Like at what point, what are you willing to spend on this hobby? What are you willing, and how do you make sure that you're keeping it, within the, my whole thing is I could spend lots and lots of money on this thing, but I'm trying to just make sure I'm breaking even with my comedy, the comedy travel that I do, the country club shows that I produce, comedy country club shows that I produce, the podcast. I'm just trying to be financially disciplined so that I'm trying to break even on all these things. And it's harder than you might think. Well, I think you might know, given that you're producing a podcast, that, it's expensive. And it's not until you reach 50,000 downloads a month that you're really going to be able to monetize this thing.
Yeah. Well, so how do you decide between the projects? What metric do you go through to figure out, I'm going to do corporate events, I'm going to do stand-up, I'm going to do podcasts, I'm going to write a book, I'm going to do blogs?
I think my biggest weakness is focus right now. It's because I do stand-up comedy. I produce a podcast. I've produced 40 episodes a year for 5 years. I probably put 10 to 12 hours of preparation time into each episode. That's 400 to 500 hours a year that I'm putting into the podcast. I've written a manuscript. I write on a Substack. I probably wrote 20 something pieces last year. And so I think if I said, okay, you know what, I'm only going to do one of these things, that I'd be further, and I do some corporate speaking too. I'm speaking 3 or 4 times a year to big companies, and they're all good things, and I'm good at each of them. But if I only focused on one, I could be great at that. And at a certain point, I think, just deciding that you're going to do one thing and really be as good as you possibly can be at that thing is really, it's a discipline that is rewarded.
Well, I think if your end goal is economic, I think that's absolutely correct. But I love, Derek Sivers is, I'm sure, or maybe familiar with Derek Sivers. I know in Anything You Want, his little book that you can listen to in an hour, which I love, because just a lot of wisdom packed into an hour walking. And I know he talked about, he was programming, for gosh sakes. And he said, I can have other people program, but I love to do it. So what's the point of me owning a business that I don't get to do what I like to do? So there are plenty of things that we do for the joy of doing them, because that's the end game, is to enjoy the journey, not the end game, but that's part of the game, is to enjoy the path. So I've tried to be, so your weakness may be lack of focus. My weakness is courage. And so what I've tried to do is just pursue things that I'm curious about that scare me a little bit. Because usually the things I'm afraid to do are the things that make me grow the most. But it's hard to do when you're worried about other people's opinions.
Yeah, that's one of the voices in your head that you got to let go of first. I remember when I just left Facebook and was maybe a year out, and I went to an open mic, and I went to a few open mics, and then I went to one open mic, and I bombed so bad that on the way home I was like, I need to get a job. And I was, and I started applying for very safe jobs that I knew I could get, but it weren't too, like, I could have tried to get a bigger job, but then I didn't want to commit to all the travel and stuff. And so I sort of half-assed it. And when you half-ass your ambitions, you're going to get half-ass results. And I spent a year working in this job, and turns out that the software at the company where I worked didn't work. And so I left after a year. And that was an important experience, because it made me say, if I'm not doing exactly what I want to do, then that's dereliction of opportunity, because I have the resources. If I'm not a jerk and I don't try to fly private, this capital should last, knock on wood. But if I have the resources to do what I want to do and I just kind of play it safe, well, that's the deathbed regret that's drawn me to comedy in the first place.
I would even I do this a lot, so forgive me, but I would almost put a spiritual bent on that. To me, it seems like bad stewardship. You've got gifts that you're not using.
I don't think you have to be spiritual to value your life. And when I say spiritual, I mean in the tradition of any structured religion. And because I believe that, and I'm non-religious, but I think that what is absolutely true is that we each have this one life, and that you want to make the best of every day. I start every podcast by saying it's a great day to be alive. And that's a reminder to me. And if my audience takes that for what it's worth, to just say, hey, you know whatever I got hanging over my head, most of it, 99% of it, is inconsequential nonsense that we stress ourselves out about. Obviously you got a sick kid, you got financial problems. That's a whole different story. But, I'm trying to value this one life that I have. And that if I kept pursuing, the big money, I would be rewarded in that currency. I would be rewarded in money, as opposed to being rewarded in how I feel when I wake up. And I think that's the most important metric that I have. And so every morning, I put my feet on the floor and I just remind myself that it is a great day to be alive, that I've got this opportunity to go and do the things that I find interesting. Having this conversation, writing, working on my comedy for this weekend, that I've got 2 shows in North Carolina. I'm like, okay, what am I going to do this weekend? And that stuff, compared to the feeling I had when I was, working in the corporate world, every morning I'd wake up and I'd be like, what problems are on the other side of this thing? These are not problems anymore. They're opportunities. And so that's an invaluable metric. And I didn't necessarily feel that way when I right after I made the money. I had to come to that, to say, this is the goal. The goal is to be me. The goal is to figure out how to take this one life and show up authentically in every way that I can toward the things that I find interesting. And those things that I find interesting are writing, telling jokes, and doing the podcast. And I've met so many great people through the podcast. I wouldn't have gotten to spend 45 minutes talking to LL Cool J had I not started this podcast. I wouldn't have. I've spoken to journalists and authors and the head of TED and all these interesting people. And it's like, well, I got to do that because I've committed to something, and I don't know where it's going to go. It could continue to do what it's doing. And people tell me all the time, wow, I really get a lot out of your podcast. That's the reward I get. I'd like to be able to do it at a bigger level. And I say that knowing that even if I get to that next level, I'm still just going to want to get to the next level. Because these same ambitions we have around money and wanting more, we have around notoriety and fame. But it would be nice to get to a point where, it's not costing money, or, I'm not begging people to listen to it. You want that vector to turn, kind of the attention vector to come back to you, instead of putting it out there in the world and say, please listen.
Right. Yeah. Well, putting a bow on this mid to late career executive in transition, it sounded like your advice was, what could you continue to grow and learn about that you would be interested in doing 10 years from now? And, be intentional about your weeks and your planning that are in alignment. And the last part was really all about, at least the last part of what I heard when you were talking about the metrics was, figure out your values, figure out what matters, and make sure that your scorecard is the right scorecard. Remember what game you're playing, because your game is different than my game and the next person's game. Don't measure yourself against their game.
Or the past you. And I want to make sorry, Jeff, I know you want to move on, but I want to make one more point.
I want to go deep as you want to go on it.
Be ready to adapt, because there's these things that, for example, I always said when I was working, and these little bugs get in your head and they're counterproductive. But I always said, when you're working, you're like, well, boy, I'd be reading so many more books if I didn't have, if I wasn't working 80 hours a week. I'd be in so much better shape if I wasn't working 80 hours a week. And that's probably true. Or, you know what, if I wasn't working 80 hours a week, I could learn to speak Spanish the way I've always wanted to learn how to speak Spanish. So one of the things I did not long after I quit was sign up for Spanish lessons. And I took these lessons for a couple of months. And, the first part, you're really just kind of getting your vocabulary back and you're getting some basic sentence structure and that kind of thing. And then you start getting into these verb tenses, the past pluperfect and the future blah, blah, conditional or blah, blah, blah. And then I remembered why I stopped taking Spanish back in college. And it's because it's hard. And because if you really want to speak Spanish, you got to practice. You got to do the drills. You've got to actually have the discipline to speak it, and maybe even go live in a country where they speak Spanish, because it's got to be ingrained in you. And then I was like, oh, work wasn't what was keeping me from learning Spanish. What was keeping me from learning Spanish was the lack of desire to do the work that it takes to learn Spanish. And so that hobgoblin in my head made me less satisfied at work. And yet it was debunked when I tried to go and do it. And so I was like, oh, okay, maybe me learning Spanish isn't the exact manifestation of wanting to continue to learn and grow in a non-corporate way. So there's going to be some things you have in your head about, when I quit, I'm going to do this. And then you're going to go, oh, it's actually not as satisfying as I thought it was. Maybe you don't need to be a single digit handicap or to break par at your golf. Maybe just being with friends playing golf 3 times a month is going to be okay. So just be willing to adapt and to change, but just make sure you continue to move forward.
Yeah, I love it. That's very helpful. So you talked earlier about the pond that you're swimming in and the impact that has on the choices that you make. And you were talking about, being in the LA community, I guess, and what that does to your perception of what success is. Can you speak a little bit about that? Because again, it reminds me of the line I just said before about remembering what game you're playing, but it's hard to do. I know, I grew up in South Georgia, in a small town in South Georgia, went to a great little independent high school, and then went to the University of Georgia. And so as soon as you join a fraternity at the University of Georgia, you start wearing the same clothes, speaking the same language, using the same slang. And, if their socioeconomic is a little bit higher, you'll start living like those guys, even though that's not what and you move to Atlanta and you live in a community, and we all do it because we're human, I suppose. But you spoke to that before about moving back home and getting out of the fishbowl, I guess.
And when I started reading about money, before I started the podcast, I was in that situation you described. I left my job and it was great for 3 to 6 months, but then you start going, wait a minute. You start seeing all the things that you're missing from work. And so I started reading about money, and I started understanding kind of the way our brains are wired and have evolved to think about money and success and status. And one of the things that is a primary driver of why we work and why we are rarely satisfied is the human need to compare ourselves to others. And you're not even conscious of it until you stop to think about what it does to you. I thought, and I believe it's a shared trait, we think that, hey, I want to make $1 million because if I make $1 million, I'll be happy. Why? Because $1 million is a lot of money. And then you make $1 million. And then you realize how much you got to give away in taxes. And you got to realize, and then you realize, oh, I don't need $1 million. I want a lake house. I need $5 million. And you get there and you buy the lake house and you go, oh, well, the lake house is, it's not just the lake house, it's the boats and the jet skis. And okay, you know what? It's got to be 10 and 50, and it just keeps moving on. And the more money you make, the more you start hanging out with people who have money. And so that level of satiation just continues to rise. It is not an evil inclination, but it is not a productive inclination either, unless you can catch yourself and say, wait a minute, what do I believe is going to provide me with more satisfaction in life? The next level of wealth that is going to allow me to join a country club, fly private, buy my third house, whatever it is, or the ability to live life on my terms. And it's just too easy to fall into the automatic assumption that being the person who has more money is going to make you happier. The people who, I had a guy on the show, Mike Norton, who's a professor at Harvard Business School. He co-wrote a book with Elizabeth Dunn from the University of British Columbia called Happy Money. In that book, they lay out some studies where, we all know, and I interviewed Angus Deaton, Sir Angus Deaton, Princeton economist who co-authored this study with Daniel Kahneman, finding that there's no additional happiness after $75,000 a year in annual income. We've heard that. Your listeners have heard that cited over and over again. And sometimes people would say, well, it's not 75,000 in my city, it's 150,000. Okay, fine. And by the way, that study's 12 or 14 years old. So time value of money, maybe it's 200 grand, whatever it is. The point is once our basic needs are satisfied, more money doesn't eliminate pain. It provides additional comfort. And there are declining marginal returns to additional comfort, right? Like going from a Volkswagen that is perfectly fine to an Audi is less than going from a complete junker to a reliable Volkswagen. That's a real change in your happiness level. But Norton and Dunn said, okay, well, all due respect to Kahneman and Deaton, millionaires don't return surveys. So let's find out what they want. And so they got millionaires records from a bank, and they surveyed like 2,000 millionaires. And they asked them, how happy are you on a scale of 1 to 10? And then they said, what would it take for you to be a 10 in happiness? And all of them said 2 to 3 times what I have right now. So it doesn't matter if you're a single-digit millionaire or a double-digit millionaire or whatever, everybody wants more. The horizon is by definition just outside of your reach. And the trick our brains play on us is to think, well, if I just had a little bit more, then I'd be happy. And it's absolutely untrue. And so, one of the things that I've been doing as much as I can is meditating. And meditating it sounds all hippy dippy sometimes, but all you're doing is closing your eyes and listening and observing what's going on in your brain. You don't have to believe in reincarnation to meditate. You don't have to burn incense. You don't have to,
do you have to sit on a pillow? Do you have to, with my legs crossed?
You can sit on a chair and close your eyes and just observe, try to focus on your breath and observe all the craziness in your head. And when you start doing that, you realize, where's all this stuff coming from? And it's all self-created. And if we're just led by the crazy thoughts in our head, we're going to live a life that's not purposeful, right? That's not intentional. And so if you can stop and say, why am I doing all this stuff? Why am I moving my family for the 3rd time just to get to that next promotion? Or why am I working 90 hours a week to get that next $1 million? What if I just kept working a little bit longer at a more manageable rate? It's not all or nothing. And so becoming aware of those voices of comparison in our heads will really help free you to say, what's important is this, being with these people in my life. What's important is continuing to grow in this activity that I want to get better at as a human, or spending this much time working for an organization that's going to improve Habitat for Humanity or something. Before I die, I want to help build 5 houses for people who can't afford them, who are going to then occupy that house and be a productive member of society and help break the cycle of poverty in their families. That's what I want to do. And so you make, you allocate time for each of those things in your life, and you keep moving forward, and you try to block out, or you try to examine those negative thoughts in your head, or the thoughts that are leading you away from what you are committed to when you've stopped to think about it.
Yeah. Well, this is why I like your show so much, your podcast, Crazy Money, is because you come at, so I think the challenge we have today is we have the most affluent society in history, and we're all unhappy, for part of the reasons we're talking about. And, I attack it from a different level in terms of the tactical financial planning, I guess. But I love your show because you have really, first of all, a really diverse group of people on your show. You have celebrities, you have academics, you have thought leaders, and a whole bunch authors on a whole bunch of subjects. But it all comes down to their personal journey with and it's pretty interesting because people that you had a local musician on that I grew up with, in the 80s, Kevin Kinney, I think, from Driving.
Sure, yeah.
And totally engaging and totally likable and nothing like my perception of him, right? But you hear his story, and I learned something about meaning, purpose, happiness, what really matters. And I get the same thing when you've interviewed other people that are, so what I like about, the Crazy Money Show is you are having broad conversations with broad people, both the academic as well as life stories. But it's always tying back to, sort of, what did you learn, once you had this success in some of those. And it's shocking how, I mean, we're the again, we're super affluent society, but and yet we're so poor in terms of joy and meaning and satisfaction because of this. And it's, and it's all your fault because you were one of the top first 250 in Facebook. So I blame you, Paul.
The software we're working with in our heads is the same software they had 2,000, 5,000 years ago, right? The only thing that's changed is all this stuff, right? I'm holding up my phone if you're listening, and this is a comparison nightmare because we're sitting there looking at everybody's curated life on Instagram and on Facebook, and we're saying, well, why don't I have that? Why am I not at this level of comedy? Why am I not vacationing in Sardinia with my family, like my neighbor? You don't know if your neighbor's leveraged, mortgaged his house to pay for that trip or not, because nobody posts pictures of Vegas and says, "Oh, I lost, 50 grand in Vegas this weekend." Nobody ever says that. You ever seen that?
No,
nobody ever comes in.
Been looking for it.
It's all, everybody's a winner. Everybody's a winner, and it's like, that's not how life is. But the technology just makes it harder to remain centered on what you value, and so. In some of these interviews, like with Ryan Holiday, the guy that writes the Daily Stoic, and he's written many best-selling books, as I'm reading it, and I'm reading about Epictetus and all these guys, they're talking about the same things that make us unhappy today. That the inability to sit quietly in a room with your thoughts is the hardest thing that we have to deal with. That not comparing yourself to others, and it was cloaks and chariots 2,000 years ago, and today it's your slick, new suit and your Mercedes. It's like, stop it. It's becoming conscious of the tricks your brain plays on you to make you unhappy is the first step in freeing yourself from those things. And I'm not saying this is somebody, I haven't achieved nirvana, and I'm not enlightened. I'm just trying to be more purposeful about it.
Well, you're putting great stuff out there. I was going to ask you early on, but do you have, then this is too big a question in the time that we have, but I'm going to throw it out anyway. So what would you say your why is? What do you have stealing the Simon Sinek, line? What's your why?
My why is to tell the truth in a world where people, aren't able to. And it's getting, and I try not to make my podcast too political, but my Substack, I kind of tackle some more political issues. But there's a lot of craziness going on in our world politically, both on the left and the right. And people who have jobs, people who have kids in schools, they can't say what they really believe because they're afraid of being punished for it. And you can't cancel me because I don't have a job to lose. You can't book me less at your comedy club if you're not booking me. So, cancel me.
I love it. Yeah.
So I want to tell the truth, and I want to figure out how to be me in the best way possible. I want to figure out how to improve showing up authentically in what I write and what I say on stage. Those are my creative whys.
Let's plug your resources because I think they're valuable. I think they'll add value to the people that run across this show. So tell us about how our guests or our audience can find you, your blog, your podcast, stand-up acts you have late in June or early July, would maybe even, if you want to plug a couple of those, would be fine. How do we find you?
I'll be at the Cary Theater this weekend in Cary, North Carolina. That's May 17th. And when is this coming out, by the way?
This will be late June. Yes.
Well, you missed me in North Carolina. Okay. Mid-June. Yeah. The 19th through the 23rd, I'll be in Sarasota, Tampa, Vero Beach, someplace else. And then I'm moving to New York City July 1st. So I don't know where I'll be after that. So yes, I'm transplanting my family. But if you want to find me online, I'm on Instagram at Paul_Ollinger, or just search Paul Ollinger, Ollinger, and you'll find my website, and you can sign up for everything there.
Oh, cool. Yeah. And like I said, the podcast is really worth listening. I listened to several episodes on a recent trip. And really, again, it may be data mining because you speak about things that really interest me, but it's just, I can't stress enough how varied the guests are that you pull out some really cool stuff. So thank you. Thank you for being the guest today. I really enjoyed our conversation. I'm glad that I ran across you through Shaping Wealth. And I know my audience found some value as well because it was very helpful. Thanks a lot, Paul. And audience, thank you for joining us today. I hope you found it helpful. If you'd like to learn more about our firm, you can reach us or check us out at tandemgrowth.com. If you'd like to learn more about me and my book, The Money and Meaning Journey, it's available at all the online retailers, and you could check it out also at jeffbernierauthor.com. If you'd like to give me some feedback, please send me an email at moneyandmeaning@tandemgrowth.com. And if you like the show, please give us a rating and some thoughts. And we really appreciate your attention today. So have a great day. And as I like to say, go find what makes your heart come alive and put the plans in place to pursue it. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to the Money and Meaning Show with Jeff Bernier, a show dedicated to help you gain the confidence and freedom to lead a life of personal significance and help you get your actions and resources in alignment with what matters most. We would love to hear from you. If you have any questions or comments on the show, feel free to reach out to us at moneyandmeaning@tandemgrowth.com, or you can find us on the web at www.tandemgrowth.com. Jeff Bernier is the President and Chief Investment Officer at Tandem Growth Financial Advisors, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. This show is a production of Tandem Growth Financial Advisors, LLC. All information discussed is general in nature, is provided for informational purposes only, and should not be construed as specific financial, legal, or tax advice. Listeners should consult an attorney or tax professional regarding their specific legal or tax situation. Listeners should not rely on the content of this podcast